I always believed my life would begin later. Not in a dramatic way. I didn't imagine a single turning point or a sudden transformation. I just assumed that everything meaningful was waiting somewhere ahead of me after I was more prepared, more stable, more certain. So I lived in rehearsal. I told myself that the version of me making sacrifices today was doing it for the version of me who would finally live tomorrow. That patience was an investment. That postponement was discipline. And for a long time, that belief carried me. I wasn't unhappy. I wasn't lost. I was functioning, which felt close enough to living that I didn't question it too hard. I worked. I planned. I maintained relationships that felt reasonable. I avoided unnecessary risks. I stayed busy enough to drown out doubt. Time passed quietly. That's how it gets you. Years don't disappear with alarms. They leave softly, like guests you meant to speak to but never did. And because nothing catastrophic happens, you assume nothing important is being lost. I remember telling myself, over and over, there will be time. Time to change direction. Time to say what I really felt. Time to become the person I kept postponing. I treated life like a draft I could revise indefinitely. The first crack appeared when someone asked me a question I couldn't answer honestly: "Are you happy?" I said yes without thinking. The word came out automatically, smooth and practiced. But the moment it left my mouth, I felt something tighten inside me, not because it was false, but because it was incomplete. I wasn't unhappy. I was unfinished. And I had been unfinished for so long that it felt normal. I started noticing how often I spoke about my life in the future tense. How frequently I used phrases like one day, eventually, when things settle. I talked about myself like someone I hadn't met yet. That realization unsettled me, but not enough to change anything. Change requires urgency. And I believed I had time. I watched people around me make choices I was still thinking about. Some failed. Some succeeded. Some surprised themselves. I told myself I was being smart by observing, by learning from their outcomes. But observation turned into avoidance. Every year, my list of reasons to wait grew longer: responsibilities, expectations, obligations that made sense individually but collectively formed a cage I pretended was shelter. I told myself I was being realistic, mature, careful. In truth, I was afraid of choosing something that would make all the other possibilities disappear. Because choosing means closing doors. Waiting keeps them open, at least in your imagination. The body notices what the mind avoids. I started feeling tired in a way sleep didn't fix. Conversations felt repetitive. Achievements landed without weight. Even moments that should have mattered passed through me like background noise. Still, I waited. Then something happened that shouldn't have felt significant but did. I realized I couldn't remember the last time I felt excited about my own future. Not anxious. Not hopeful in theory. Excited. That absence scared me more than fear ever had. Because fear means you care about the outcome. Indifference means you're already leaving. I tried to dismiss it. Told myself this was adulthood. That passion fades. That meaning is overrated. But late at night, when distractions fell away, one thought returned again and again: what if later never comes? I didn't want to believe that. It felt dramatic. Irrational. Almost insulting to the idea that life is fair. So I ignored it. Until the day I realized something irreversible had already happened. I hadn't lost my life all at once. I had spent it, waiting. After that realization, time stopped feeling neutral. It felt accusatory. Every calendar reminder, every passing birthday, every casual comment about age or years ahead landed differently. I began to feel time not as something abundant, but as something quietly subtracting itself while I stood still. Nothing external forced this awareness on me. There was no tragedy, no loss dramatic enough to justify panic. That almost made it worse. Because I couldn't blame fate. I couldn't say life had interrupted me. Life had been waiting. And I hadn't shown up. I tried to negotiate with myself. I told myself I was being too harsh. That everyone feels this way sometimes. That meaning comes in waves. That I just needed rest, perspective, maybe a change of pace. So I adjusted the surface. I rearranged my schedule. Took short breaks. Tried new routines. Read the right words. Ask the right questions. I did everything except the one thing that scared me most, choosing without certainty. Because certainty had become my condition for living. If I didn't know how something would end, I didn't start it. If I couldn't guarantee stability, I didn't move. If I couldn't explain a choice clearly to others, I postponed it. That logic had kept me safe. It had also kept me small. I started noticing how often I framed fear as responsibility. How easily I convinced myself that restraint was virtue. How many times I chose predictability over curiosity and called it maturity. Waiting had become my identity. An identity, once formed, resists being questioned. The internal breakdown didn't come with chaos. It came with a slow unraveling of excuses. Each one stopped working in turn. Each reason I had used to delay myself began to sound hollow when repeated too many times. One night, alone, I tried to imagine my future the way I always had, vaguely, optimistically, comfortably distant. And for the first time, the image refused to appear. There was nothing there. Not because the future was empty, but because I had no relationship with it anymore. I had treated it like a storage unit for all the life I wasn't ready to live yet. And storage units fill up. That was when the moral dilemma became impossible to ignore. If I changed now, I would destabilize everything I had carefully built. I would disappoint people who trusted my consistency. I would have to admit that years of patience weren't leading anywhere specific. If I didn't change, I would continue existing in a life that felt technically fine and emotionally vacant, a life that asked nothing of me except endurance. Neither option felt clean. One meant loss I could explain to others. The other meant loss only I would ever feel. I began to grieve things I hadn't technically lost yet. The conversations I would never have because the moment had passed. The paths that had quietly closed while I was considering them. The version of myself who believed time was generous. That grief surprised me. Because it wasn't loud. It didn't demand attention. It sat with me quietly, like someone who had already accepted the outcome. I realized then that waiting had not protected me from regret. It had been manufacturing it. Slowly. Efficiently. Without resistance. The hardest truth settled in gradually. I wasn't afraid of failure. I was afraid of choosing something that would make all my waiting meaningless. Because if I acted now, I would have to admit that I could have acted earlier. And that realization felt unbearable. So I stayed suspended between action and avoidance, aware enough to suffer, not brave enough to move. That limbo was the darkest place I had ever been. Not because it hurt intensely, but because it drained quietly. And in that quiet, one final question emerged, heavier than all the others: how much of my life was I willing to lose just to avoid making the wrong choice? I didn't have the answer yet. But I knew, with unsettling clarity, that time was no longer on my side. And whatever I chose next, action or continued waiting, would finally count as a decision. The decision didn't arrive with courage. It arrived with exhaustion. I reached a point where waiting hurt more than any possible mistake. Where the weight of what I was losing silently became heavier than the fear of choosing loudly. I didn't feel brave. I felt out of time. That distinction matters. People imagine change as a moment of inspiration. A clean break. A surge of confidence. For me, it was the opposite. It was the quiet understanding that if I didn't act now, I would never act at all, not because I couldn't, but because I would keep finding reasons not to. Waiting had taught me how to survive indefinitely without living. So I chose something small. Intentionally small. Not a reinvention. Not an escape. Just a decision that could not be postponed. A truth I had been circling for years, finally spoken without decoration or justification. And the world didn't applaud. Some people were confused. Some were disappointed. Some tried to talk me out of it, gently, reasonably, with concern that sounded a lot like the logic I had been using against myself for years. They weren't wrong. They were just late, because the real cost of waiting is invisible to everyone except the person paying it. From the outside, my life had looked intact. From the inside, it had been thinning for a long time. Acting didn't fix that instantly. What it did was painful in a different way. It forced me to feel the grief I had delayed. The regret I had stored. The anger I had redirected into patience and called maturity. All of it surfaced at once, and there was no longer a future version of myself to hand it off to. I had to carry it now. That was the price of finally showing up. Some nights, I lay awake thinking about everything I lost to later. The opportunities that didn't wait. The conversations that expired. The people I could have been closer to if I hadn't assumed there would always be more time. That grief doesn't disappear. But it changes shape. It becomes a boundary. A reminder. A quiet refusal to go numb again. I didn't reclaim my life in a dramatic way. I didn't become fearless. I didn't suddenly know exactly who I was or where I was going. What I gained was something simpler and heavier: presence. The ability to feel my days as they pass. The ability to choose without demanding certainty. The ability to accept that some losses come from waiting too long and that acknowledging them is part of living honestly. I learned that time doesn't punish you for mistakes. It punishes you for hesitation. If you're listening to this and you recognize that familiar calm, the kind that looks stable but feels hollow, I want to tell you something without urgency, without instruction. You don't need to know exactly what you want to stop waiting. You don't need a perfect plan to begin. You don't even need confidence. You only need to stop treating your life like something that will start later. Because one day, later becomes never. I thought I had time. And by the time I understood what that belief was costing me, most of my life had already been quietly spent. I don't wait anymore. Not because I'm certain. But because I finally understand how expensive certainty really is.